So there's an old joke in archaeology.
Yes, there are jokes in archaeology. It surprised me too.
Anyway, the joke is when you find something you have no idea what it is, which happens a lot, you call it cultic. Well, there's a new joke that's developing in the field, and that's to say that every ceramic assemblage is evidence of feasting.
You find a cooking pot.
Feasting.
2 serving bowls.
Feasting.
A collection of drinking vessels.
Feasting.
I guess this is the kind of humor that you develop when you spend all your time digging up stuff from people who aren't there to tell you how bad your jokes are.
Obviously, we know not everything is feasting, but feasting was certainly an important social and political event in the ancient world.
And we don't necessarily share this same sense of festivity in our meals, but as we approach Thanksgiving, our own feasting festival, it's something that's worth looking at. Pull up a chair to the table with us as we explore the practice of feasting in the ancient world.
We use the words feasting and feast quite a bit nowadays, but for archaeologists and anthropologists, feasting is more than just when you and your family eat a lot of food. Feasting in this sense is a lot more than binging a huge meal. Feasting in the ancient world doesn't really have much to do with caloric intake. Instead, a feast is a central social event oriented toward abundant display and communal consumption with ritualizing tendencies. So what does that mean? Well, it's a time when communal relations are supported and reified around displays of food and drink, and where particular rituals and protocols are important features of the event. Now, food and customs around the world are important ways of reinforcing and developing community to this day. And when your church or social group wants to do something to build community, what do? Often you share a meal together. Feasts, though, are usually when people will either eat more food than usual or eat special foods that are not consumed on a daily basis. For example, in the ancient world, this often entailed the consumption of meat, which was typically not consumed on a regular basis. Feasts are also time to negotiate social and political status. It's a time for people to flaunt their excess and negotiate greater social standing. They're often politically charged events where status is maintained or established. In the ancient world, feasts were also important for maintaining and deepening social ties. Put another way, feasts functioned to bond people together within the broader rubric of commensality. Just like today, ancient feasts were about a lot more than just food. So if feasting is a social practice with social and political implications, how do we recognize social and political customs in archaeology through people's material artifacts? Well, there are a handful of indicators that let us know when and where feasting occurred. First, we find written records of feasts. These are not just narrative descriptions of feasts, though we do find those, but administrative documents that account for the preparations of feasts, and we also find pictorial depictions of feasts, say on Attic vases depicting symposia or a specific kind of feast in the classical Greek world. We also find animal remains as evidence of feasting. Zooarchaeologists analyze collections of animal bones at archaeological sites, and it's pretty amazing what they can determine about human practices by closely examining those bones. They can look at the type of bone, the sex and age of the animal to determine things like herding practices. They can also identify things like butcher marks to help us know when a large assemblage of bones is a mark of accumulation over time, or something like a feasting episode where the bones accumulated in a short period of time. Ceramic assemblages can also mark feasting. Indicators of feasting include things like food preparation dishes, large amounts of serving dishes like bowls, particularly large concentrations of what are called open vessels, concentrations of prestige or luxury ceramic vessels, or large storage vessels. These are all common features of many ceramic assemblages, so their presence does not necessitate feasting, and you have to evaluate each assemblage to assess whether it is a feasting assemblage or not. And finally, for feasting, you usually need preparation space for the food as well as a formal area where feasting occurred, and there are usually prestige items associated with those places. Feasting appears quite a bit in the Bible, but because we don't have the same social customs around feasting, we tend to gloss over it in the text and not really appreciate what's going on. Feasts, at least in ancient Israel, could be either regular or occasional. Regular feasts are those which occurred at regular and predictable intervals. The Bible prescribes several feasts like this, like Passover, the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Weeks, and so on. These were feasts or festivals that corresponded with the ritual or liturgical calendar or the agricultural calendar. Other examples of regular biblical feasts include the New Moon Festival and even the Sabbath. These feasts were not only meals, but they had ritual or religious significance. And while these feasts, particularly ones like Passover and the Feast of Booths, came to be celebrated later at the Jerusalem Temple, it seems that these later feasts mimic those originally held in individual homes. And for example, Job's children seem to alternate hosting these religious feasts, kind of like your family may rotate who's hosting Thanksgiving each year. The occasional feasts usually revolved around the life cycle: birth, Circumcision, puberty, marriages, and funerals would all have feasting associated with them. These feasts occurred at occasional intervals, but they still had prescribed expectations and rituals.
Let's look at a few examples. The first one comes from Daniel chapter 5. This is the story of the handwriting on the wall that the prophet Daniel reads and interprets for the Babylonian king. Daniel 5:1 gives the context for that story as a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles, where he drank wine with them. Now, this is a classic example of a feast. The king is using this event as a way of maintaining social relations with other powerful individuals in his kingdom. Now, not only is he maintaining relations with them, but he's using it as a time of display. He's showing off his wealth and not so subtly reminding those nobles of how great he is and how he got that wealth. As the story develops, a mysterious hand writes a cryptic message on the wall of the banquet hall, and none of the sages of Babylon can read it. Only Daniel can, and he delivers a message of doom and destruction for the Babylonian king, in part because of his ostentatious display with the objects taken from the Jerusalem temple. The conspicuous consumption of the feast is juxtaposed with the message of destruction. Another place we see feasts is in 1 Kings 3. Solomon, having just sought God in a dream and been rewarded with great wisdom, made offerings before the Ark of the Covenant and threw a feast for his court. Now, this was an important step for the young king. He needed to build cohesion with his court and a sense of legitimacy as the rightful king with those around him. A feast was an important way to do this. Now, it's worth noting that this feast follows a religious ritual, making it hard to divorce feasting from ritual activity and the king. We see again in 1 Kings 8 that after Solomon dedicated the temple, he held a feast. We see ritual, temple, God, and king all intertwined in Solomon's feasting activity.
The religious underpinnings of Solomon's feast are perhaps contrasted with the feasting of Nabal in 1 Samuel 25. Nabal was portrayed as a fool and a foil to the young and hot-headed David. In this story, Nabal was holding a feast like that of a king, even though he wasn't a king. Nabal thought too highly of himself and feasted as a king does, all while having a feud with God's anointed king. Nabal was not simply eating a lot, but was undertaking a symbolically loaded, ritualized activity that had echoes of kingship, something the author Samuel does not approve of. Eventually, Nabal's haughtiness leads to his downfall, and to add insult to injury, his wife Abigail became David's wife.
One final example comes from 1 Kings. Jeroboam recognized the societal significance of feasts. You'll recall that Jeroboam became king of the northern tribes after they rebelled against Rehoboam, Solomon's son. Jeroboam was concerned that the people would revert to being loyal to Rehoboam if they continued to go to Jerusalem for their regular feasts. And if the people returned to Rehoboam, where would that leave Jeroboam? Nowhere good, that's for sure. So Jeroboam set up new cultic sites, one in the north at Dan and one in the south at Bethel, which we read about in 1 Kings 12. He seemingly invented a new regular feast out of thin air so that his people would utilize these cult sites and build their loyalty to him. Feasts had such an important role in social and political cohesion that Jeroboam had to ensure that those feasts worked towards legitimizing and supporting his role as the new king. The significance and function of feasting is one of many things in the Bible that are largely lost to us today. We read about someone in the Bible throwing a feast, and all we picture is lots of food and dancing and carousing. We miss both the religious importance of feasts and their social and political purposes until we dig into the history beneath the text. People in the ancient world didn't often throw a party just to throw a party. They feasted with specific ends in mind, and when we understand those purposes, it helps us better understand why and how feasting features prominently in many places throughout the Bible. Now, in a way, that's not very different than the reasons we feast today, although you may not have taken much time to consider those reasons. We have feasts to mark milestones, to mark rites of passage, to bond with friends, and to give thanks to God. We have rituals and traditions that mark these feasts, like singing Happy Birthday or praying over the Thanksgiving dinner. Politicians and business leaders have banquets to demonstrate their status and convince others to support their agendas. Over the course of thousands of years, maybe feasting hasn't changed that much after all. So the next time you see feasting in the Bible, take a minute to stop and think about its purpose, what it's accomplishing, and how its presence in the text might give you insight into the inner workings of the biblical narrative. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you want to learn more about this topic, we've included some references and resources in the description below. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content like it, be sure to subscribe to our channel, give this video a like, and follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Beneath the Bible. If you learned something new today, take a minute to share this video with your friends. And until next time, keep digging.